Bring perfection to the Coral City, said Tarvitz. Guide us well, replied Rylanor, his voice loaded with unspoken meaning. Tarvitz was suddenly certain that the dreadnought wanted Tarvitz to remain on the ship. Do the Emperor's work, Captain Tarvitz, ordered Rylanor. Tarvitz saluted and said, I will, as Rylanor set off across the Hall of Rites towards the banquet, his every step heavy and pounding. Tarvitz watched him go, wondering if he would ever see the Ancient again. The dormitories tucked into the thick walls running the length of the gantry were dark and hot, and from the doorway Mercedy could see down into the engine compartment, where the crew were indistinguishable sweating figures who worked in the infernal heat and ruddy glow of the plasma reactors. They hurried across gangways that stretched between the titanic reactors and clambered along massive conduits that hung like spider webs in the hellish gloom. She dabbed sweat from her brow at the heat and close confines of the engine space, unused to the searing air that stole away her breath and left her faint. Mercedy, said Cinderman, coming to meet her along the gantry. The iterator had lost weight, his dirty robes hanging from his already spare frame, but his face was alight with the relief and joy of seeing her. The two embraced in a heartfelt hug, both grateful beyond words to see each other. She felt tears pricking her eyes at the sight of the old man, unaware until this moment of how much she had missed him. Kirill, it's so good to see you again, she sobbed. You just vanished. I thought they'd got to you. I didn't know what had happened to you. Hush, Mercedy, said Cinderman. It's all right. I'm so sorry I couldn't send word to you at the time. You must understand that had I a choice, I would have done everything I could to keep you out of this. But I don't know what to do anymore. We can't keep her down here forever. Mercedy looked through the doorway of the dormitory room they stood outside, wishing she had the courage to believe, as Kirill did. Don't be ridiculous, Kirill. I'm glad you made contact. I thought Malachurst or Maggard had killed you. Maggard very nearly did, said Cinderman. But the Saint saved us. She saved you? Asked Mercedy. How? I don't know exactly, but it was just like in the archive chamber. The power of the Emperor was in her. I saw it, Mercedy, just as sure as you're standing here before me. I wish you could have seen it. I wish that too, she said, surprised to find that she meant it. She entered the dormitory and stared down at the still form of Euphrates Keeler on the thin cot bed, looking for all the world as if she was simply sleeping. The small room was cramped and dirty, with a thin blanket spread on the deck beside the bed. Winking starlight streamed in through a small porthole vision block, something greatly prized this deep in the ship, and without asking, she knew that someone had happily volunteered to give up their prized room for the use of the Saint and her companion. Even down here in the dark and the stink, faith flourished. I wish I could believe, said Mercedy, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Euphrates' chest. Cinderman said, You don't? I don't know, she said, shaking her head. Tell me why I should. What does believing mean to you, Kirill? He smiled and took her hand. It gives me something to hold on to. There are people on this ship who want to kill her. And somehow, don't ask me how, I just know that I need to keep her safe. Are you not afraid? She asked. Afraid, he said. I've never been more terrified in my life, my dear. But I have to hope that the Emperor is watching over me. That gives me strength and the will to face that fear. You are a remarkable man, Kirill. I'm not remarkable, Mercedy, said Cinderman, shaking his head. I was lucky. I saw what the Saint did, so faith is easy for me. It's hardest for you have seen nothing. You have to simply accept that the Emperor is working through Euphrates, but you don't believe, do you? Mercedy turned from Cinderman and pulled her hand from his, looking through the porthole at the void of space beyond. No, I can't. Not yet. A white streak shot across the porthole like a shooting star. Another followed it, and then another. What's that? He asked. Cinderman leaned over to get a better look through the porthole. Even through his exhaustion, she could see the strength in him that she had previously taken for granted, and she blink-clicked the image, capturing the defiance and bravery she saw in his features. "Drop pods," he said, pointing at a static gleaming object, stark against the blackness and closer to Istvan III. Tiny sparks began raining from its underside towards the planet below. "I think that's the Andronius, Fulgrim's flagship," said Cinderman. "Looks like the attack we've been hearing about has begun. Imagine how it would be if we could watch it unfolding." Euphrates groaned, and the attack on Istvan III was forgotten as they slid across to sit beside her. Mercedy saw Cinderman's love for her clearly as he mopped her brow, her skin so clean that it practically shone. For the briefest moment, Mercedy saw how people could believe Euphrates was miraculous. Her body, so pale and fragile, yet untouched by the world around her. Mercedy had known Keela as a gutsy woman, never afraid to speak her mind or bend the rules to get the magnificent picts for which she was rightly famed. But now she was something else entirely. "Is she coming round?" asked Mercedy. "No," said Cinderman sadly. "She makes noises, but she never opens her eyes. It's such a waste. Sometimes I swear she's on the brink of waking, but then she sinks back down into whatever hell she's going through in her head." Mercedy sighed and looked back out into space. The pinpoints of light streaked in their hundreds towards Istvan III. As the spear tip was driven home, she whispered, "Loken." The coral city was magnificent. Its design was a masterpiece of architecture, light and space, so wondrous that Peter Egan Momus had begged the War Master not to assault so brutally. Older by millennia than the Imperium that had come to claim it in the name of the Emperor, its precincts and thoroughfares were soon to become blood-slick battlefields. While the juggernaut of compliance had made the galaxy a sterile, secular place, the Coral City remained a city of the gods. The Precentor's Palace, a dizzying creation of gleaming marble blades and arches that shone in the sun, opened like a vast stone orchid to the sky, and the polished granite of the city's wealthiest districts clustered around it like worshippers. Momus had described the palace as a hymn to power and glory, a symbol of the divine right by which Istvan III would be ruled. Further out from the palace, and beyond the architectural perfection of the Coral City, vast, multi-layered residential districts sprawled. Connected by countless walkways and bridges of glass and steel, the avenues between them were wide canyons of tree-lined boulevards in which the citizens of the Coral City lived. The city's industrial heartland rose like climbing skeletons of steel against the eastern mountains, belching smoke as they churned out weapons to arm the planet's armies. War was coming, and every Istvanian had to be ready to fight. But no sight in the Coral City compared to the Siren Hold. Not even the magnificence of the palace outshone the Siren Hold, its towering walls defining the Coral City with their immensity. The brutal battlements diminished everything around them, and the sacred fortress of the Siren Hold humbled even the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. Within its walls, enormous tomb spires reached for the skies, their walls encrusted with monumental sculptures that told the legends of Istvan's mythical past. The legends told that Istvan himself had sung the world into being, with music that could still be heard by the blessed war singers, and that he had borne countless children with whom he populated the first ages of the world. They became night and day, ocean and mountain, 1,000 legends whose breath could be felt in every moment of every day in the Coral City. Darker carvings told of the lost children, the sons and daughters who had forsaken their father and been banished to the blasted wasteland of the fifth planet, where they became monsters that burned with jealousy and raised black fortresses from which to brood upon their expulsion from paradise. War, treachery, revelation, and death, all marched around the Siren Hold in endless cycles of myth, the weight of their meaning, pinning the Coral City to the soil of Istvan III and infusing its every inhabitant with their sacred purpose. The gods of Istvan III were set to sleep in the Siren Hold, whispering their murderous plots in the nightmares of children and ancients. For a time, the myths and legends had remained as distant as they had always been, but now they walked among the people of the Coral City, and every breath of wind shrieked that the lost children had returned. Without knowing why, the populace of Istvan III had armed and unquestioningly followed the orders of Varda's Prow to defend their city. An army of well-equipped soldiers awaited the invasion they had long been promised was coming in the western marches of the city, where the war singers had sung a formidable web of trenches into being. Artillery pieces parked in the gleaming canyons of the city pointed their barrels westwards, set to pound any invaders into the ground before they reached the trenches. The warriors of the Coral City would then slaughter any that survived in carefully prepared crossfire. The defenses had been meticulously planned, protecting the city from attack from the west, the only direction in which an invasion could be launched. Or so the soldiers manning the defenses had been told. The first omen was a fire in the sky that came with the dawn. A scattering of falling stars streaked through the blood-red dawn, burning through the sky like fiery tears. The sentries in the trenches saw them falling in bright spears of fire, the first burning object smashing into the trenches amid a plume of mud and flame. At the speed of thought, the word raced around the Coral City that the lost children had returned, that the prophecies of myth were coming true. They were proven right when the drop pods burst open and the Astartes of the Death Guard Legion emerged, and the killing began. Part 2. The Coral City. Chapter 8. Soldiers from Hell. Butchery. Betrayal. 30 seconds! Yelled Vipers, his voice barely audible over the screaming jets as the drop pods sliced through Istvan III's atmosphere. The Astartes of Lucasta were bathed in red light, and for a moment Loken imagined what they would look like to the people of the Coral City when the assault began. Warriors from another world. Soldiers from Hell. "What's our landing point looking like?" shouted Loken. Vipers glanced at the readout on a pict screen mounted above his head. "Rifting! We'll hit the target, but off-center. I hate these things. Give me a Stormbird any day." Loken didn't bother replying, barely able to hear Nero as the atmosphere thickened beneath the drop pod and the jets on its underside kicked in. The drop pods shuddered and began heating up as the enormous forces pushing against it turned to fire and noise. He sat through the last few minutes while everything around him was noise, unable to see the enemy he was about to fight, and relinquishing control over his fate until the drop pod hit. Nero had been right when he said he had preferred an assault delivered by Stormbird, the precise surgical nature of an airborne assault far preferable to a warrior than this hurtling descent from above. But the War Master had decided that the spear tip would be deployed by drop pod, reasoning, rightly Loken admitted, that thousands of Astartes smashing into the defenders' midst without warning would be more psychologically devastating. Loken ran through the moment the drop pod would hit in his mind, preparing himself for when the hatch charges would blow open. He gripped his bolter tightly and checked for the 10th time that his chainsword was in its scabbard at his side. Loken was ready. 10 seconds, Lucasta! Shouted Vipers. Barely a second later, the drop pod impacted with such force that Loken's head snapped back, and suddenly the noise was gone, and everything went black. Lucius killed his first foe without even breaking stride. The dead man's armor was like glass, shimmering and iridescent, and his halberd's blade was fashioned from the same reflective substance. A mask of stained glass covered his face, the mouth represented by leading and filled with teeth of gem-like triangles. Lucius slid his sword clear, blood smoking from its edge, as the soldier slumped to the floor. A curved arch of marble shone red in the dawn's early light above him, and a swirl of dust and debris drifted around the drop pod he had just leapt from. The precentor's palace stood before him, vast and astonishing, a stone flower with the spire at its center like a spectacular twist of overlapping granite petals. More drop pods hammered into the ground behind him. The plaza around the palace's north entrances, the main objective of the Emperor's children. A nearby drop pod blew open. An ancient Rylanor stepped from its red-lit interior, his assault cannon already cycling and tracking for targets. "Nausicaa!" yelled Lucius. "To me!" Lucius saw a flash of colored glass from inside the palace, movement beyond the sweeping stone panels of the entrance hall. More palace guards reacted to the sudden, shocking assault, but contrary to what Lucius had been expecting, they weren't screaming or begging for mercy. They weren't even fleeing, or standing stock still, numb with shock. With a terrible war cry, the palace guard charged, and Lucius laughed, glad to be facing a foe with some backbone. He leveled his sword and ran towards them, Squad Nausicaa following behind him, weapons at the ready. 100 palace guardians ran at them, resplendent in their glass armor. They formed a line before the Astartes, leveled their halberds, and opened fire. Searing needles of silver filled the air around Lucius, gouging the armor of his shoulder guard and leg. Lucius lifted his sword arm to shield his head, and the needles spat from the glowing blade of his sword. Where they hit the stone around the entrance, it bubbled and hissed like acid. One of the Nausicaa fell beside Lucius, one arm molten and his abdomen bubbling. "Perfection and death!" cried Lucius, running through the white-hot silver needles. The Emperor's children and the palace guard clashed with a sound like a million windows breaking, the terrible screaming of the halberd guns giving way to the clash of blade against armor and point-blank bolter fire. Lucius's first sword blow hacked through a halberd shaft and tore through the throat of the man before him. Sightless glass eyes glared back at him, blood pumping from the guard's ruined throat, and Lucius tore the helm from his foe's head to better savor the sensation of his death. A plasma pistol spat a tongue of liquid fire that wreathed an enemy soldier from head to foot, but the man kept fighting, sweeping his halberd down to cut deep into one of Lucius's men before another Astartes ripped off his head with a chainsword. Lucius pivoted on one foot from a halberd strike and hammered the hilt of his sword into his opponent's face, feeling a tight anger that the faceplate held. The guard staggered away from him, and Lucius reversed his grip and thrust the blade through the gap between the glass plates at the guard's waist, feeling the blade's energy field burning through abdomen and spine. These guards were slowing the Emperor's children down, buying precious moments with their lives for something deeper in the palace. As much as Lucius was reveling in the sensations of the slaughter, the smell of the blood, the searing stink of flesh as the heat of his blade scorched it, and the pounding of blood in veins, he knew he could not afford to give the defenders such moments. Lucius ran onwards, slicing his blade through limbs and throats as he ran. He fought as though following the steps of an elaborate dance, a dance where he played the part of the victor and the enemy were there only to die. The palace guard were dying around him, and his armor was drenched with their blood. He laughed in sheer joy. Warriors still fought behind him, but Lucius had to press on before the palace guard was able to stall their advance with more men in front of them. "Squad Commandil, Ritharin, kill these and then follow me!" Fire soared from every direction as the Emperor's children forced their way towards the junction Lucius had reached. The swordsman darted his head past the corner, seeing a vast indoor seascape. A plume of water cascaded through a hole in the center of a colossal granite dome, and a shaft of pink light fell alongside the water, sending brilliant rainbows of color between the arches formed by the petals of the dome's surface. Islands rose from the indoor sea that took up most of the dome, each topped by picturesque follies of white and gold. Thousands of palace guards massed in the dome, splashing towards them through the waist-deep sea and taking up positions among the follies. Most wore the glassy armor of the men still dying behind Lucius, but many others were clad in far more elaborate suits of bright silver. Others still were wrapped in long streamers of silk that rippled behind them like smoke as they moved. Rylanor emerged into the dome behind Lucius, his assault cannon smoking, and the chisel-like grips of his power fist thick with blood. "They're massing!" spat Lucius. "Where are the damned world-eaters?" "We shall have to win the palace by ourselves," replied Rylanor, his voice grating from deep within his sarcophagus. Lucius nodded, pleased that they would be able to shame the World Eaters. "Ancient, cover us! Emperor's children, break and cover fire! Nausicaa, keep up this time!" Ancient Rylanor stepped out from the junction, and a spectacular wave of fire sheared through the air around him. A storm of heavy-caliber shell casings and oil-soaked fumes streaming from the cannon mounted on his shoulder. His explosive fire shredded the stone of the foremost island's follies, broken and bloodied bodies tumbling from the shattered wreckage. "Go!" shouted Lucius, but the Emperor's children were already charging, their training so thorough that every warrior already knew his place in the complex pattern of overlapping fire and movement that sent the strike force sweeping into the dome. Savage joy lit up Lucius's face as he charged, the thrill of battle and the sensations of killing stimulating his body with wondrous excess. In a swirling cacophony of noise, the perfection of death had come to the Coral City. On the southern side of the palace, a strange, organically formed building clung to the side of the palace like a parasite, its bulging liquid shape more akin to something that had been grown than something built. Its pale marble was threaded with dark veins, and the masses of its battlements hung like ripened fruit. From the expanse of marble monument slabs marking the passing of the city's finest and most powerful citizens, it was clear that this was a sacred place. Known as the Temple of the Song, it was a memorial to the music that Father Istvan had sung to bring all things into existence. It was also the objective of the World Eaters. The word that the invasion had begun was already out by the time the first World Eaters' drop pods crashed into the plaza, shattering gravestones and throwing slabs of marble into the air. Strange music keened through the morning air, calling the people of the Coral City from their homes and demanding that they take up arms. The soldiers from the nearby city barracks grabbed their guns as the war singers appeared on the battlements of the temple to sing the song of death for the invaders. Called by the war singers' laments, the people of the city gathered in the streets and streamed towards the battle. The World Eaters' strike force was led by Captain Erlen, and as he emerged from his drop pod, he was expecting the trained soldiers that Angron had briefed them on, not thousands of screaming citizens swarming onto the plaza. They came in a tide, armed with anything and everything they had in their homes. But it was not the weapons they carried, but their sheer numbers, and the terrible song that spoke of killing and murder that made them deadly. "World Eaters, to me!" yelled Erlen, hefting his bolter and aiming it into the mass of charging people. The white-armored warriors of the World Eaters formed a firing line around him, turning their bolters outwards. "Fire!" shouted Erlen, and the first ranks of the Coral City's inhabitants were cut down by the deadly volley. But the oncoming mass rose up like a spring tide as they clambered over the bodies of the dead. As the gap between the two forces closed, the World Eaters put up their bolters and drew their chainswords. Erlen saw the unreasoning hatred in the eyes of his enemies and knew that this battle was soon to turn into a massacre. If there was one thing at which the World Eaters excelled, it was massacre. "Damn it!" spat Vipers. "We must have hit something on the way in." Loken forced his eyes open. A slice of light where the drop pod had broken open provided the only illumination, but it was enough for him to check that he was still in one piece. He was battered, but could feel no evidence of anything more than that. "Lacasta, sound off!" ordered Vipers. The warriors of Lacasta shouted their names, and Loken was relieved to hear that none appeared to have been injured in the impact. He undid the buckle of his grav harness and rolled to his feet. The drop pod canted at an unnatural angle. He pulled his bolter from the rack and pushed his way through the narrow opening broken in the side of the drop pod. As he emerged into the bright sunshine, he saw that they had struck a projecting pier of stone on one of the towers, the rubble of its destruction scattered around the ruined drop pod. He circled the wreckage, seeing that they were at least 200 meters above the ground, wedged amongst the massive battlements of the Siren Hold. To his left, he saw spectacular tomb spires encrusted with statues, while to his right was the Coral City itself, its magnificent structures bathed in the rosy glow of the sunrise. From this vantage point, Loken could see the whole city. the extraordinary stone flower of the palace, and the western defenses like scars across the landscape. Loken could hear gunfire from the direction of the palace and realized that the Emperor's children and world-eaters were already fighting the enemy. Gunfire echoed from below, sons of Horus units fighting in the tangle of shrines and statuary that filled the canyons between the tomb spires. "We need a way down," said Loken, as Lacaster pulled themselves from the wreckage of the drop pod. Vipers jogged over with his gun at the ready. "Bloody ground surveyors must have missed the projections," he grumbled. "That's what it looks like," agreed Loken, as he saw another drop pod ricochet from the side of a tomb spire and careen downwards in a shower of broken statues. "Our warriors are dying," he said bitterly. "Someone's going to pay for this." "We look spread out," said Vipers, glancing down into the siren hold. Between the tomb spires, smaller shrines and temples butted against one another in a complex jigsaw. Plumes of black smoke and explosions were already rising from the fighting. "We need a place to regroup," said Loken. He flicked to Torgadon's Vox channel. "Tarek, Loken here. Where are you?" A burst of static was his only reply. He looked across the siren hold and saw one tomb spire close to the wall, its many levels supported by columns wrought into the shapes of monsters, and its top sheared off by the impact of a drop pod. "Damn. If you could hear me, Tarek, make for the spire by the western wall, the one with the smashed top. Regroup there. I'm heading down to you." "Anything?" asked Vipers. "No. The Vox is a mess. Something's interrupting it." "The spires?" "It would take more than that," said Loken. "Come on, let's find a way off this damn wall." Vipers nodded and turned to his men. "Lacaster, start looking for a way down." Loken leaned over the battlements as Lacaster fanned out to obey their leader's command. Beneath him he could see the diminutive figures of Astartes fighting black-armored warriors in streaming firefight. He turned away, desperate to find a way down. "Here!" shouted Brother Casto, Lacaster's flamer-bearer. "A stairway!" "Good work," said Loken, making his way over to see what Casto had found. Sure enough, hidden behind a tall, eroded statue of an ancient warrior was a dark stairway cut into the sand-colored stone. The passageway looked rough and unfinished, the stone pitted and crumbling with age. "Move," said Vipers. "Casto, lead the way." "Yes, Captain," replied Casto, plunging into the gloom of the passageway. Loken and Vipers followed him, the entrance barely wide enough for their armored bodies. The stairs descended for roughly 10 meters before opening into a wide, low-ceilinged gallery. "The wall must be riddled," said Vipers. "Catacombs," said Loken, pointing to niches cut into the walls that held the mouldering remains of skeletons, some still swaddled in tattered cloth. Casto led them along the gallery, the bodies becoming more numerous the deeper they went, the skeletal remains piled 2 or 3 deep. Vipers snapped around suddenly, bolter up and finger on the trigger. "Vipers." "I thought I heard something." "We're clear behind," said Loken. "Keep moving and focus. This could—" "Movement," said Casto, sending a blast of orange-yellow fire from his flamer into the darkness ahead of him. "Casto," barked Vipers. "Report. What do you see?" Casto paused. "I don't know. Whatever it was, it's gone now." The niches ahead guttered with flames, hungrily devouring the bare bones. Loken could see that there was no enemy up ahead, only Istvanian dead. "There's nothing there now," said Vipers. "Stay focused, Lacaster, and no jumping at shadows. You are sons of Horus." The squad picked up the pace, shaking thoughts of hidden enemies from their minds as they moved rapidly past the burning grave niches. The gallery opened into a large chamber, Loken guessing that it must have filled the width of the wall. The only light was from the dancing flame at the end of Casto's flamer, the yellow light picking out the massive stone blocks of a tomb. Loken saw a sarcophagus of black granite, surrounded by statues of kneeling people with their heads bowed and hands chained before them. Panels set into the walls were covered in carvings where human forms acted out ceremonial scenes of war. "Casto, move up," said Vipers. "Find us a way down." Loken approached the sarcophagus, running his hand down its vast length. Its lid was carved to represent a human figure, but he knew that it could not be a literal portrait of the body inside. Its face had no features save for a pair of triangular eyes fashioned from chips of colored glass. Loken could hear the song from the siren hold outside, even through the layers of stone, a single mournful tone that rose and fell, winding its way from the tomb spires. "War singer," said Loken bitterly. "They're fighting back. We need to get down there." The silver-armored palace guards started flying. Surrounded by burning arcs of white energy, they leapt over the advancing Emperor's children, gleaming, leaf-shaped blades slicing downwards from wrist-mounted weapons. Lucius rolled to avoid a hail of blades, the silver guards swooping low to behead two of Squad Commando, the charged blades cutting through their armor with horrific ease. He slid into the water, finding that it only reached his waist. Above him, the halberd guns of the palace guard were spraying silver fire at the Emperor's children, but the Astartes were moving and firing with their customary discipline. Even the bizarre sight of the palace's defenders did not dissuade them from their patterns of movement and covering fire. A body fell into the water next to him, its head blasted away by bolter fire, and blood pouring into the water in a scarlet bloom. Lucius saw that the silver guards were too quick and turned too nimbly for conventional engagement. He would just have to engage them unconventionally. One of the silver guards dived towards him, and Lucius could see the intricate filigree on the man's armor, the tiny gold threads like veins on the breastplate and greaves, and the scrollwork that covered his face. The guard dived like a seabird, firing a bright blade from his wrist. Lucius turned the missile aside with his sword and leapt to meet his opponent. The guard twisted in the air, trying to avoid Lucius, but he was too close. Lucius swung his sword and sliced the guard's arm from his body, his crackling sword searing through the armor. Blood sprayed from the smoldering wound, and the guard fell, twisting back towards the water. Lucius fell with the dead man, splashing back into the lake as the Emperor's children finally reached their enemy. Volleys of bolter fire scoured the islands, and his warriors advanced relentlessly on the survivors. The palace guards were backing away, forming a tighter and tighter circle. Glass-armored guards lay dead in heaps, and the artificial lake was ruddy pink and choked with bodies. Rylander's assault cannon sent fire tearing through the silk-clad guards, whose preternatural speed couldn't save them as the cannon shells turned the interior of the dome into a killing ground. Another silver guard fell, bolter fire ripping through his armor. Squad Nassicade joined Lucius, and he grinned wolfishly at them, elated at the prospect of fighting more of the silver guards. "They're running," said Lucius. "Keep them on the back foot. Keep pressing on." "Squad Catheron's reporting from the plaza," said Brother Sketherin. "The World Eaters are fighting around the temple on the north side." "Still? Sounds like they're holding off half the city." "Ha! They can have them. It's what the World Eaters are good at," laughed Lucius, relishing the certain knowledge of his superiority. Nothing in the galaxy could match that feeling, but already it was fading, and he knew he would have to procure yet more opponents to satisfy his hunger for battle. "We press on to the throne room," he said. "Ancient Rylanor, secure our rear. The rest of you, we're going for prowl. Follow me. If you can't keep up, go and join the Death Guard." His warriors cheered as they followed Lucius into the heart of the palace. Every one of them wanted to kill Prowl and hold his head aloft on the palace battlements so the whole of the Coral City could see. Only Lucius was certain that Prowl's head would be his. The Andronius was quiet and tense, its palatial rooms dark and its long, echoing corridors empty of all but menials. The ship's engines pulsed dimly in the stern, only the rumble of directional thrusters shuddering through the ship. Every station was manned, every blast door was sealed, and Tarvitz knew a battle alert when he saw it. What confused him was the fact that the Istvanians had no fleet to fight. The hull groaned, and Tarvitz felt a deep rumbling through the metal deck, sensing the motion of the ship before the artificial gravity compensated. Ever since the first wave of the spear tip had launched, the vessel had been moving, and Tarvitz knew that his suspicions of something amiss were well founded. According to the mission briefings he had read earlier, Fulgrim's flagship had been assigned the role of launching the second wave once the palace and the siren hold had been taken. There was no need to move. The only reason to move a vessel after a launch was to move into low orbit in preparation for a bombardment. Though he told himself he was being paranoid, Tarvitz knew that he had to see for himself what was going on. He made his way swiftly through the Andronius towards the gun decks, keeping clear of such grand chambers as the Tarsilian amphitheatre and the columned grandeur of the monument hall. He kept to the areas of the ship where his presence would go unchallenged, and where those who might recognize him were unlikely to see him. He had told Rylanor that he wanted to renounce his position of honor in the spear tip, to replace Captain Odovacar as Eidolon's senior staff officer, relaying the commander's orders to the surface, but it would only be a matter of time before his subterfuge was discovered. Tarvitz descended into the lower reaches of the ship, far from where the Emperor's children dwelt in the most magnificent parts of the Andronius. The rest of the ship, inhabited by servitors and menials, was more functional, and Tarvitz knew he would pass without challenge here. The darkness closed around Tarvitz, and the yawning chasms of the engine structures opened out many hundreds of meters below the gantry on which he stood. Above the engine spaces were the reeking gun decks, where mighty cannons, weapons that could level cities, were housed in massive, armored revetments. "Stand by for ordnance," chimed an automated metallic voice. Tarvitz felt the ship shift again, and this time he could hear the creak of the hull as the planet's upper atmosphere raised the temperature of the outer hull. Tarvitz descended an iron staircase at the end of the dark gantry, and the vast expanse of the gun deck sprawled before him, a titanic vault that ran the length of the vessel. Huge hissing cranes fed the guns, lifting tank-sized shells from the magazine decks through blast-proof doors. Gunners and loaders sweated with their riggers, each gun serviced by 100 men who hauled on thick chains and levers in preparation for their firing. Servitors distributed water to the gun crews, and Mechanicum adepts maintained vigil on the weapons to ensure they were properly calibrated. Tarvitz felt his resolve harden and his anger grow at the sight of the guns being made ready. Who were they planning to fire on? With thousands of Astartes on the planet's surface, bombarding the Coral City was absurd. Yet here the guns were, loaded and ready to unleash hell. He doubted that the men crewing these weapons knew which planet they were in orbit over, or even who they would be shooting at. Entire communities flourished below the decks of a starship, and it was perfectly possible that these men had no idea who they were about to destroy. He reached the end of the staircase and set foot on the deck, its high ceiling soaring above him like a mighty cathedral to destructive power. Tarvitz heard footsteps approaching and turned to see a robed adept in the livery of the Mechanicum. "Captain," inquired the adept, "is there something amiss?" "No," said Tarvitz. "I'm just here to ensure that everything is proceeding normally." "I can assure you, Lord, that preparations for the bombardment are proceeding exactly as planned. The warheads will be launched prior to the deployment of the second wave." "Warheads?" asked Tarvitz. "Yes, Captain," said the adept. "All bombardment cannons are loaded with air-bursting warheads, loaded with virus bombs as specified in our order of battle." "Virus bombs?" said Tarvitz, fighting to hold back his revulsion at what the adept was telling him. "Is everything all right, Captain?" asked the adept, noticing the change in his expression. "I'm fine," Tarvitz lied, feeling as if his legs would give way any second. "You can return to your duties." The adept nodded and set off towards one of the guns. Virus bombs. Weapons so terrible and forbidden that only the War Master himself and the Emperor before him could ever sanction their use. Each warhead would unleash the Life-Eater virus, a rampant organism that destroyed life in all its forms and wiped out every shred of organic matter on the surface of a planet within hours. The magnitude of this new knowledge and its implications staggered Tarvitz, and he felt his breath coming in short, painful gasps as he attempted to reconcile what he knew with what he had just learned. His legion was preparing to kill the planet below, and he knew with sudden clarity that it could not be alone in this. To saturate a planet with enough virus warheads to destroy all life would take many ships, and with a sick jolt of horror, he knew that such an order could only have come from the War Master. For reasons Tarvitz could not even begin to guess at, the War Master had chosen to betray fully a third of his warriors, exterminating them in one fell swoop. "I have to warn them," he hissed, turning and running for the embarkation deck. Chapter 9. The Power of a God. Regrouping. Honor Brothers. The strategium was dark, lit only by braziers that burned with a flickering green flame. Where once the banners of the Legion's battle companies had hung from its walls, they were now replaced with those of the Warrior Lodge. The company banners had been taken down shortly after the spear tip had been deployed, and the message was clear. The Lodge now had primacy within the Sons of Horus. The platform from which the War Master had addressed the officers of his fleet now held a lectern upon which rested the Book of Lorgar. The War Master sat on the strategium throne, watching reports coming in from Istvan III on the battery of pict screens before him. The emerald light picked out the edges of his armor and reflected from the amber gemstone forming the eye upon his breastplate. Reams of combat statistics streamed past, and picked relays showed the unfolding battles in the Coral City. The World Eaters were in the center of an epic struggle. Thousands of people were swarming into the plaza before the Precentor's palace, and the streets flowed with rivers of blood as the Astartes slaughtered wave after wave of Istvanians that charged into their guns and chain blades. The palace itself was intact, only a few palls of smoke indicating the battle raging through it as the Emperor's children fought their way through its guards. Vardus Pral would be dead soon, though Horus cared nothing for the fate of Istvan III's rogue governor. His rebellion had simply given Horus the chance to rid himself of those he knew would never follow him on his great march to Terra. Horus looked up as Erebus approached. "First Chaplain," said Horus sternly, "matters are delicate. Do not disturb me needlessly." "There is news from Prospero," said Erebus, unperturbed. The shadow whisperers clung to him, darting around his feet and the croziers he wore at his waist. "Magnus?" asked Horus, suddenly interested. "He lives yet," said Erebus, "but not for the lack of effort on the part of the wolves of Fenris." "Magnus lives," snarled Horus. "Then he may yet be a danger." "No," assured Erebus. "The spires of Prospero have fallen, and the warp echoes with the powerful sorcery Magnus used to save his warriors and escape." "Always sorcery," said Horus. "Where did he escape to?" "I do not know yet," said Erebus. "But wherever he goes, the Emperor's dogs will hunt him down." "And he will either join us or die alone in the wilderness," said Horus, thoughtfully. "To think that so much depends on the personalities of so few. Magnus was nearly my deadliest enemy, perhaps as dangerous as the Emperor himself. Now he has no choice but to follow us until the very end. If Fulgrim brings Ferrus Manus into the fold, then we have as good as won." Horus waved dismissively at the view screens depicting the battle in the Coral City. "The Istvanians believe the gods have come to destroy them, and in a way they are right. Life and death are mine to dispense. What is that if not the power of a god?" "Captain Loken, Sergeant Vipers, it is good to see you both," said Sergeant Lacoste, hunkered down in the shattered shell of a shrine to one of Istvan III's ancestors. "We've been trying to raise all the squads. They're all over the place. The spear tip's shattered." "Then we'll reforge it here," replied Loken. Sporadic fire rattled through the valley, so he took cover beside Lacoste. The sergeant's command squad was arrayed around the shrine ruin, bolters trained and occasionally snapping off shots at the shapes that darted through the shadows. Vipers and the survivors of Lacasta huddled in the ruins with them. The enemy wore the armor of ancient Istvan, tarnished bands of silver and black, and carried strange relic weapons, rapid-firing crossbows that hurled bolts of molten silver. Tales of heroism were emerging from the scores of individual battles among the tomb spires, as Sons of Horus units fought off the soldiers of the Siren Hold. "We've got good cover and a position we can hold," said Vipers. "We can gather the squads here and launch a thrust into the enemy." Loken nodded as Torgadon ducked into cover beside them, the Sons of Horus he had brought with him, joining Lacoste's men at the walls. He grinned at Loken and said, "What kept you, Garvey?" "We had to come down from the top of the wall," said Loken. "Where are your warriors?" "They're everywhere," said Torgadon. "They're making their way to this spire, but a lot of the squads are cut off. The Siren Hold was garrisoned by some elites, I suppose. They had a hell of an armory here. Ancient things. Looks like advanced tech." Loken nodded as Torgadden continued. Well, this spire is clear at least. I've got Vadden and Lacoste setting up a command post on the lower level, and we can just hold this position for now. There are 3 more legions in the Coral City and the rest of the Sons of Horus in orbit. There's no need... The enemy has the field, replied Loken sharply. They can surround us. There are catacombs beneath our feet they could use to get around us. Now, if we stay put, they will find a way to get to us. This is their territory. We strike as soon as we can. This is a spear tip, and it is up to us to drive it home. Where? Asked Torgadden. The tomb spires, said Loken. We hit them one by one, storm them, kill whatever we find, and move on. We keep going and force them onto the back foot. Most of our spear tip is on its way, Captain, said Lacoste. Good, replied Loken, looking up at the spires around the shrine. The shrine was in a valley formed by the spire they had come down, and the next spire along, a brutal cylinder of stone with glowering faces carved into its surface. Dozens of arches around its base offered entrance and cover, their darkness occasionally lit by a brief flash of gunfire. A tangle of shrines littered the ground between the towers, statues of the Coral City's notable dead jutting from piles of ornate architecture or the ruins of temples. Loken pointed to the tomb spire across the valley. As soon as we have enough warriors for a full thrust, that's what we hit. Lacoste starts securing the shrines around us to give us a good jumping-off point, and get some men up on the first levels of this spire to provide covering fire. Heavy weapons, if you've got them. Gunfire echoed from the east, and Loken saw the forms of Astartes moving towards them. Sons of Horus in the livery of Escalon's squad. More warriors were converging on their position, each fighting their own running battles among the shrines as they sought to regroup. This is more than a burial ground, said Loken. Whatever happened to Istvan III, it started here. This force is religious, and this is their church. No wonder they're crazy, replied Torgadden scornfully. Madmen love their gods. The controls of the Thunderhawk were loose, the ship trying to flip away from Tarvitz and go tumbling through space. He had only the most rudimentary training on these newer additions to the Astartes armory, and most of that had been in atmosphere, skimming low over battlefields to drop troops or add fire support. Tarvitz could see Istvan III through the armored glass of the viewing bay, a crescent of sunlight creeping across its surface. Somewhere near the edge of the shining crescent was the city where his battle brothers and those of 3 other legions were fighting, unaware that they had already been betrayed. Thunderhawk, identify yourself, said a voice through the gunship's box. He must have entered the engagement envelope of the Andronius, and the defense turrets had acquired him as a target. If he was lucky, he would have a few moments before the turrets locked on, moments when he could put as much distance between his stolen Thunderhawk and the Andronius. Thunderhawk, identify yourself, repeated the voice, and he knew that he had to stall in order to give himself time to get clear of the defense turrets. Captain Saul Tarvitz, traveling to the Endurance on liaison duty. Wait for authorization. He knew he wouldn't get authorization, but each second took him further from the Andronius and closer to the planet's surface. He pushed the Thunderhawk as hard as he dared, listening to the hiss of static coming from the Vox, hoping against hope that somehow they would believe him and allow him to go on his way. Stand down, Thunderhawk, said the voice. Return to the Andronius immediately. Negative, Andronius, replied Tarvitz. Transmission is breaking up. It was a cheap ploy, but one that might give him a few seconds more. I repeat, stand... Go to hell, replied Tarvitz. Tarvitz checked the navigational pict for signs of pursuit, pleased to see that there were none yet, and wrenched the Thunderhawk down towards Istvan III. The Pride of the Emperor is in transit, announced Severin, senior deck officer of the Andronius. Though the vessel's navigator claims to be encountering difficulties, Lord Fulgrim will not be with us any time soon. Does he send any word of his mission? Asked Eidolon, standing at his shoulder. Communications are still very poor, said Severin hesitantly. But what we have does not sound encouraging. Then we will have to compensate with the excellence of our conduct and the perfection of our legion, said Eidolon. The other legions may be more savage or resilient or stealthy, but none of them approaches the perfection of the Emperor's children. No matter what lies ahead, we must never let go of that. Of course, Commander, said Severin, as his console lit up with a series of warning lights. His hands danced over the console, and he turned to face Eidolon. "Lord Commander," he said, "we may have a problem." "Do not speak to me of problems," said Eidolon. "Defense Control has just informed me that they have picked up a Thunderhawk, heading for the planet's surface." "One of ours?" "It appears so," confirmed Severin, bending over his console. "Getting confirmation now." "Who's piloting it?" demanded Eidolon. "No one is authorized to travel to the surface." "The last communication with the Thunderhawk indicates that it is Captain Saul Tarvitz." "Tarvitz?" said Eidolon. "Damn him. But he is a thorn in my side." "It's certainly him," said Captain Severin. "It looks like he took one of the Thunderhawks from the planet's side embarkation deck." "Where is he heading?" asked Eidolon. "Exactly." "The Coral City," replied Severin. Eidolon smiled. "He's trying to warn them. He thinks he can make a difference. I thought we could use him, but he's too damn stubborn, and now he's got it into his head that he's a hero. Severin, get some fighters out there and shoot him down. We don't need any complications now." "Aye, sir," nodded Severin. "Fighters launching in 2 minutes." Mercedy rang out the cloth and draped it over Euphrates' forehead. Euphrates moaned and shook, her arms thrashing as if she was throwing a fit. She looked as pale and thin as a corpse. "I'm here," said Mercedy, even though she suspected the comatose imagist couldn't hear her. She didn't understand what Euphrates was going through, and it made her feel so useless. For reasons she didn't quite understand, she had stayed with Kirill Sinderman and Euphrates as they moved around the ship. The vengeful spirit was the size of a city, and it had plenty of places in which to hide. Word of their coming went ahead of them, and wherever they went, grime-streaked engine crewmen or boiler-suited maintenance workers were there to show them to safety, supply them with food and water, and catch a glimpse of the saint. At present, they sheltered inside one of the engine housings, a massive hollow tube that was normally full of burning plasma and great thrusting pistons. Now the engine was decommissioned for maintenance, and it made for a good bolt hole, hidden and secret despite its vast dimensions. Sinderman slept on a thin blanket beside Euphrates, and the old man had never looked more exhausted. His thin limbs were spotted and bony, his cheeks sunken and hollow. One of the engine crew hurried up to the room where Keeler lay on a bundle of blankets and clothes. He was stripped to the waist and covered in grease, a huge and muscular man who was moved to kneel meekly a short distance from the bed of his saint. "Miss Ollerton," he said reverently, "is there anything you or the saint need?" "Water," said Mercedy. "Clean water. And Kirill asked for more paper, too." The crewman's eyes lit up. "He's writing something." Mercedy wished she hadn't mentioned it. "He's collecting his thoughts for a speech," he said. "He's still an iterator after all. If you can find some medical supplies as well, that would be useful. She's dehydrated."
"The Emperor will preserve her,"
said the crewman, worry in his voice. "I'm sure he will. But we have to give him all the help we can," replied Mercedy, trying not to sound as condescending as she felt. The effect the comatose Euphrates had on the crew was extraordinary, a miracle in itself. Her very presence seemed to focus the doubts and wishes of so many people into an iron-strong faith in a distant emperor.
"We'll get what we can,"
said the crewman.
"We have people in the commissary and medical suites."
He reached forward to touch Euphrates' blanket and murmured a quiet prayer to his emperor. As the crewman left, she whispered her own perfunctory prayer. After all, the emperor was more real than any of the so-called gods the crusade had come across. "Deliver us, Emperor," she said quietly, "from all of this." She looked down sadly and caught her breath as Euphrates stirred and opened her eyes, like someone awakening from a deep sleep. Mercedy reached down slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she might shatter this brittle miracle, and took the imagist's hand in hers. "Euphrates?" she whispered softly. "Can you hear me?" Euphrates Keeler's mouth fell open, and she screamed in terror.
"Are you sure?"
asked Captain Garrow of the Death Guard, limping on his newly replaced augmetic leg. The gyros had not yet meshed with his nervous system, and, much to his fury, he had been denied a place in the Death Guard spear tip. The bridge of the Eisenstein was open to the workings of the ship, as was typical with the Death Guard fleet, since Mortarion despised ornamentation of any kind. The bridge was a skeletal framework suspended among the ship's guts with massive coolant pipes looming overhead like knots of metallic entrails. The bridge crew bent over a platform inset with cogitator banks, their faces illuminated in harsh greens and blues. "Very sure, Captain," replied the communications officer, reading from the data slate in his hand. "An Emperor's Children Thunderhawk is passing through our engagement zone." Garrow took the data slate from the officer, and sure enough, there was a Thunderhawk gunship passing close to the Eisenstein, a pack of fighters at its heels. "Smells like trouble," said Garrow. "Put us on an intercept course." "Yes, Captain," said the deck officer, turning smartly and heading for the helm. Within moments, the engines flared into life, vast pistons pumping through the oily shadows that surrounded the bridge. The Eisenstein tilted as it began a ponderous turn towards the approaching Thunderhawk. The scream hurled Kirill Sinderman from sleep with the force of a thunderbolt, and he felt his heart thudding against his ribs in fright. "What?" he managed before seeing Euphrates sitting bolt upright in bed and screaming fit to burst her lungs. He scrambled to his feet as Mercedes tried to put her arms around the screaming imagist. Keeler thrashed like a madwoman, and Sinderman rushed over to help, putting his arms out as if to embrace them both. The moment his fingers touched Euphrates, he felt the heat radiating from her, wanting to recoil in pain, but feeling as though his hands were locked to her flesh. His eyes met Mercedes, and he knew from the terror he saw there that she felt the same thing. He whimpered as his vision blurred and darkened, as though he were having a heart attack. Images tumbled through his brain, dark and monstrous, and he fought to hold on to his sanity as visions of pure evil assailed him. Death, like a black, seething mantle, hung over everything. Sinderman saw Mercedes' delicate, cold, dark face overcome with it, her features sinking in corruption. Tendrils of darkness wound through the air, destroying whatever they touched. He screamed as he saw the flesh sloughing from Mercedes' bones, looking down at his hands to see them rotting away before his eyes. His skin peeled back, the bones maggot white. Then it was gone. The black, rotting death lifted from him, and Sinderman could see their hiding place once again, unchanged since he had laid down to catch a few fitful hours of sleep. He stumbled away from Euphrates, and with one look saw that Mercedes had experienced the same thing. Horrendous, concentrated decay. Sinderman put a hand to his chest, feeling his old heart working overtime. "Oh no," Mercedes was moaning. "Please. What is—" "This is betrayal," said Keeler, her voice suddenly strong as she turned towards Sinderman. "And it is happening now. You need to tell them. Tell them all, Kirill." Keeler's eyes closed, and she slumped against Mercedes, who held her as she sobbed. Tarvitz wrestled with the Thunderhawk controls. Streaks of bright crimson sheared past the cockpit. The fighter craft were on his tail, spraying ruby-red lances of gunfire at him. Istvan III wheeled in front of him as the gunship spun in the viewscreen. Impacts thudded into the back of the Thunderhawk, and he felt the controls lurch in his hands. He answered by ripping his craft upwards, hearing the engines shriek in complaint beneath him as they flipped the gunship's mass out of the enemy lines of fire. Loud, juddering noises from behind him spoke of something giving way in one of the engines. Red warning lights and crisis telltales lit up the cockpit. The angry blips of the fighters loomed large in the tactical display. The Vox unit sparked again, and he reached to turn it off, not wanting to hear gloating taunts as he was destroyed and any hope of warning was lost. His hand paused as he heard a familiar voice say, "Thunderhawk, on a closing course with the Eisenstein. Identify yourself." Tarvitz wanted to cry in relief as he recognized the voice of his honor brother. "Nathaniel," he cried. "It's Saul. It's good to hear your voice, my brother." "Saul?" asked Garrow. "What in the name of the Emperor is going on? Are those fighters trying to shoot you down?" "Yes," shouted Tarvitz, tearing the Thunderhawk around again, Istvan III spinning below him. The Death Guard fleet was a speckling of glittering streaks against the blackness, crisscrossed by red laser blasts. Tarvitz gunned the Thunderhawk's remaining engine as Garrow said, "Why? And be quick, Saul, they almost have you."
This is treachery?
shouted Tarvitz.
All of this? We are betrayed. The fleet is going to bombard the planet's surface with virus bombs.
What? spluttered Garrow, disbelief plain in his voice.
That's insane. Trust me, said Tarvitz. I know how it sounds, but as my honor brother, I ask you to trust me like you have never trusted me before. On my life, I swear I do not lie to you, Nathaniel.
I don't know, Saul, said Garrow.
Nathaniel!
screamed Tarvitz in frustration.
Ship-to-surface Vox has been shut off, so unless I can get a warning down there, every Astartes on Istvan 3 is going to die.
Captain Nathaniel Garrow could not tear his eyes from the hissing Vox unit, as if seeking to discern the truth of what Saul Tarvitz was saying just by staring hard enough. Beside him, the tactical plot displayed the weaving blips that represented Tarvitz's Thunderhawk and the pursuing fighters. His experienced eye told him that he had seconds at best to make a decision, and his every instinct screamed that what he was hearing could not possibly be true. Yet Saul Tarvitz was his sworn honor brother, an oath sworn on the bloody fields of the Praxer campaign, when they had shed blood and stood shoulder to shoulder through the entirety of a bloody, ill-fated war that had seen many of their most beloved brothers killed. Such a friendship and bond of honor, forged in the hell of combat, was a powerful thing, and Garrow knew Saul Tarvitz well enough to know that he never exaggerated and never, ever lied. To imagine that his honor brother was lying to him now was beyond imagining, but to hear that the fleet was set to bombard their battle brothers was equally unthinkable. His thoughts tumbled like a whirlwind in his head, and he cursed his indecision. He looked down at the eagle Tarvitz had carved into his vambrace so long ago, and he knew what he had to do. Tarvitz pulled the Thunderhawk into a shallow dive, preparing to chop back the throttle and deploy his air brakes, hoping that he had descended far enough to allow the atmosphere of the planet below to slow him down sufficiently for what he planned. He glanced down at the tactical display, seeing the fighters moving to either side of him, preparing to bracket him as his speed bled off. Judging the moment was crucial. Tarvitz hauled back the throttle and hit the air brakes. The grav seat harness pulled tight on his chest as he was hurled forwards, and the cockpit was suddenly lit by brilliant flashes, and a terrific juddering seized the gunship. He heard impacts on the hull and felt the Thunderhawk tumble away from his control. He yelled in anger as he realized that those who sought to betray the Astartes had won, that his defiance of their treachery had been in vain. Blooms of fire surged past the cockpit, and Tarvitz waited for the inevitable explosion of his death. But it never came. Amazed, he took hold of the gunship's controls and wrestled with them as he fought to level out his flight. The tactical display was a mess of interference, electromagnetic hash and radioactive debris, clogging it with an impenetrable fog of a massive detonation. He couldn't see the fighters, but with such interference they could still be out there, even now drawing a bead on him. What had just happened? "Saul," said a voice, heavy with sadness, and Tarvitz knew that his honor brother had not let him down. "He's down. The fighters are gone."
Gone? How?
"The Eisenstein shot them down on my orders," said Garrow. "Tell me, Saul, was I right to do so? For if you speak falsely, then I have condemned myself alongside you." Tarvitz wanted to laugh and wished his old friend was standing next to him, so he could throw his arms around him and thank him for his trust, knowing that Nathaniel Garrow had made the most monumental decision in his life on nothing but what had passed between them moments ago. The depth of trust and the honor Garrow had done him was immeasurable.
"Yes," he said. "You were right to trust me, my friend."
"Tell me why," asked Garrow. Tarvitz tried to think of something reassuring to tell his old friend, but he knew that nothing he could say would soften the blow of this treachery. Instead, he said,
"Do you remember what you once told me of Terra?"
"Yes, my friend," sighed Garrow. "I told you it was old, even back in the day."
"You told me of what the Emperor built there," said Tarvitz. "A whole world, where before there had been nothing, just barbarians and death. You spoke of the scars of the Age of Strife, whole glaciers burnt away and mountains leveled."
"Yes, agreed Garrow. I remember. The Emperor took that blasted planet and he founded the Imperium there. That's what I fight for. To stand against the darkness and build an empire for the human race to inherit. That's what is being betrayed, my friend, said Tarvitz. I will not allow that to happen, Saul. Nor I, my friend, swore Tarvitz. What will you do now? Garrow paused, the question of what to do, now that he had chosen a side, uppermost in his mind. I'll tell the Andronius that I shot you down. The flare of the explosion and the fact that you're in the upper atmosphere should cover you long enough to get to the surface. And after that? The other legions must be warned of what is going on. Only the War Master would have the daring to conceive of such betrayal, and he would not have begun an endeavor of this magnitude without swaying some of his brother Primarchs to join him. Rogel Dorn or Magnus would never forsake the Emperor, and if I can get the Eisenstein out of the Istvan system, I can bring them here. All of them. Can you do it? Asked Tarvitz. The War Master will soon realize what you attempt. I have some time before they will suspect. But then the whole fleet will be after me. Why is it the men have to die every time any of us tries to do what is right? Because that's the Imperial truth, said Tarvitz. Can you keep control of the Eisenstein once this gets out? Yes, said Garrow. It will be messy, but enough of the crew are staunch Terrans, and they will side with me. Those who do not will die. The port engine juddered, and Tarvitz knew that he didn't have much time before the gunship gave out beneath him. I have to make for the surface, Nathaniel, said Tarvitz. I don't know how much longer this ship will stay in the air. Then this is where we part, said Garrow, an awful note of finality in his voice. The next time we see one another, it'll be on Terra, said Tarvitz. If we meet again, my brother. We will, Nathaniel, promised Tarvitz. By the Emperor, I swear it. May the luck of Terra be with you, said Garrow, and the Vox went dead. Moments ago he had been on the brink of death, but now he had hoped that he might succeed in preventing the War Master's treachery from unfolding. That's what the Imperial truth meant, he realized at last. It meant hope. Hope for the galaxy. Hope for humanity. Tarvitz gunned the Thunderhawk's engine, fixed its course towards the Precentor's palace, and arrowed it towards the heart of the Choral City. Chapter 10. The Most Precious Truth. Praal. Death's Tomb. The subdeck was packed with people, come to hear the words of the Saint's apostle. Apostle. That was what they called him now, thought Sinterman, and it gave him comfort to know that even in these turbulent times, he was still a person that others looked up to. Vanity, he knew, but still. One takes what one can, when circumstances change beyond one's control. Word had spread quickly through the vengeful spirit that he was about to speak, and he glanced nervously around the edges of the subdeck for any sign that word had reached beyond the civilians and remembrances. Armed guards protected the approaches to the subdeck, but he knew that if the Astartes, or Maggard and his soldiers, came in force, then not all of them would escape alive. They were taking a terrible risk, but Euphrates had made it very clear that he needed to speak to the masses, to spread the word of the Emperor, and to tell of the imminent treachery that she had seen. Thousands of people stared expectantly at him, and he cleared his throat, glancing over his shoulder to where Mercedy and Euphrates watched him standing at the lectern, raised on a makeshift platform of packing crates. A portable Vox-link had been rigged up to carry his words to the very back of the subdeck, though he knew his iterator-trained voice could be heard without any mechanical help. The Vox-link was there to carry his words to those who could not attend this gathering, faithful among the technical staff of the ship, having spliced the portable unit into the ship's principal Voxcaster network. Sinderman's words would be heard throughout the expedition fleet. He smiled at the crowd and took a sip of water from the glass beside him. A sea of expectant faces stared back at him, desperate to hear his words of wisdom. What would he tell them, he wondered. He looked down at the scribbled notes he had taken over the time he had been sequestered in the bowels of the ship. He looked back over his shoulder at Euphrates, and her smile lifted his heart. He turned back to his notes, the words seeming trite and contrived. He screwed the paper into a ball and dropped it by his side, feeling Euphrates' approval like a tonic in his veins. "My friends," he began, "we live in strange times, and there are events in motion that will shock many of you, as they have shocked me. You have come to hear the words of the saint, but she has asked me to speak to you, that I may tell you of what she has seen and what all men and women of faith must do." His iterator's voice carried the precise amount of gravitas mixed with a tone that spoke to them of his regret at the terrible words of doom he was about to impart. "The War Master has betrayed the Emperor," he said, pausing to allow the inevitable howls of denial and outrage to fill the chamber. Shouted voices rose and fell like waves on the sea, and Sinderman let them wash over him, knowing the exact moment when he should speak. I know, he said. "You think that such a thing is unthinkable, and only a short time ago I would have agreed. But it is true. I have seen it with my own eyes. The saint showed me her vision, and it chilled my very soul to see it. War-tilled fields of the dead, winds that carry a cruel dust of bone, and the sky-turned eyes of men who saw wonders and only dreamed of their children and friendship. I tasted the air, and it was heavy with blood, my friends, its stink reeking on the bodies of men we have learned to call the enemy. And for what? That they decided they did not want to be part of our warmongering imperium. Perhaps they saw more than we. Perhaps it takes the fresh eyes of an outsider to see what we have become blind to." The crowd quietened, but he could see that most people still thought him mad. Many here were of the faithful, but many others were not. While almost all of them could embrace the Emperor as divine, few of them could countenance the War Master betraying such a wondrous being. When we embarked on this so-called Great Crusade, it was to bring enlightenment and reason to the galaxy. And for a time, that was what we did. But look at us now, my friends. When was the last time we approached a world with anything but murder in our hearts? We bring so many forms of warfare with us, the tension of sieges and the battlefield of trenches soaked in mud and misery, while the sky is ripped with gunfire. And the men who lead us are no better. What do we expect from cultures who are met by men named War Master, Widowmaker, and the Twisted? They see the Astartes, clad in their insect carapaces of plate armor, marching to the grim sounds of cocking bolters and roaring chainswords. What culture would not try to resist us? Sinderman could feel the mood of the crowd shifting and knew he had stoked their interest. Now he had to hook their emotions. Look to what we leave behind us. So many memorials to our slaughters. Look to the Lupercal's court, where we house the bloody weapons of war in bright halls and wonder at their cruel beauty as they hang waiting for their time to come again. We look at these weapons as curios, but we forget the actuality of the lives these savage instruments took. The dead cannot speak to us. They cannot plead with us to seek peace while the remembrance of them fades and they are forgotten. Despite the ranks of graves, the triumphal arches and eternal flames, we forget them. For we are afraid to look at what they did, lest we see it in ourselves. Sinderman felt a wondrous energy filling him as he spoke, the words flowing from him in an unstoppable torrent, each word seeming to spring from his lips of its own volition, as though each one came from somewhere else, somewhere more eloquent than his poor, mortal talent could ever reach. We have made war in the stars for 2 centuries, yet there are so many lessons we have never learned. The dead should be our teachers, for they are the true witnesses. Only they know the horror and the ever-repeating failure that is war, the sickness we return to, generation after generation, because we fail to hear the testament of those who were sacrificed to martial pride, greed, or twisted ideology. Thunderous applause spread from the people directly in front of Sinderman, spreading rapidly through the chamber, and he wondered if such scenes were being repeated on any of the other ships of the fleet that could hear his words. Tears sprang to his eyes as he spoke, his hands gripping the lectern tightly as his voice trembled with emotion. Let the battlefield dead take our hands in theirs and illuminate us with the most precious truth we can ever learn, that there must be peace instead of war. Lucius skidded to the floor of what appeared to be some kind of throne room. Inlaid with impossibly intricate mosaic designs, the floor was covered in scrollwork so tightly wound that it seemed to ripple with movement. Bolter-fire stitched through the room, showering him with broken pieces of mosaic as he rolled into the cover of an enormous harpsichord. Music from the dawn of creation boomed around him, filling the central spire of the precentor's palace. Crystal chandeliers hung from the petals at the center of the great granite flower, shimmering and vibrating in time with the cacophony of battle far below. Instruments filled the room, each one played by a servitor, refitted to play the holy music of the war singers. Huge organs with pipes that reached up through the shafts of milky morning light stood next to banks of gilded bells, and rank upon rank of bronze cages held shaven-headed choristers who sang with blind adulation. Harp strings snapped and twanged in time with the gunfire, and discordant notes boomed as bolter shots ripped through the side of the organ. Storms of weapons fire flew, filling the air with hot metal and death, the battle and the music competing to make the loudest din. Lucius felt his limbs become energized just listening to the crashing volume of the noise, each blaring note and booming shot filling his senses with a desire to do violence. He glanced round the side of the harpsichord, exhausted and elated to have reached so far so quickly. They had fought their way through the palace, killing thousands of the black and silver armored guards, before finally reaching the throne room. From his position of cover, Lucius saw that he was in the second ring of instruments, beyond which lay the precentor's dais. A mighty throne with its back to him sat upon the dais, a confection of gold and emerald set in a ring of lecterns that each held a massive volume of musical notations. Gunfire blew one book apart, and a blizzard of sheet music fluttered around the throne. The palace guard massed on the opposite side of the throne room, surrounding a tall figure in gold armor with a collection of tubes and what looked like loudspeakers fanning out from his back. A storm of silver fire flew, and Lucius saw yet more guards charging in from the other entrances, a ferocious struggle erupting as these new arrivals charged the Emperor's children. "They have courage, I'll give them that," he muttered to himself. Chain blades and bolt pistols rang from armor, and storms of silver fire ripped between the patches of cover offered by the gilded instruments. Each volley tore up the hardwood frames and soared through servitors as they sat at the ornate keyboards or plucked at strings with metal fingers. And still the music played. Lucius glanced behind him. One of the Nasicae fell as he ran to join Lucius. Silver filaments punched through his skull. The body clattered to the floor beside Lucius. Only 3 of Nasicae remained, and they were cut off from their leader. "Ancient Rylanor, engage!" yelled Lucius into the Vox. "Get me cover! Tactical squads, converge on the throne and draw the palace guard in! Purity and death!" "Purity and death!" echoed the Emperor's children, and with exemplary coordination they surged forward. A silver-armored guard was shredded by bolter fire and flopped broken to the ground. Glass-armored bodies lay shattered and bloody over bullet-scarred instruments. Servitors moved jerkily, still trying to play even though their hands were smoking ruins of bone and wire. The Emperor's children moved squad by squad, volley by volley, advancing through the fire as only the most perfect of legions could. Lucius broke cover and ran into the whirlwind of fire. Silver shards shattered against him. Behind him, Rylanor's dreadnought body smashed through a titanic bank of drums and bells, the noise of its destruction appalling as Rylanor opened fire on the enemy. Acrobatic guards, clad in armor wound with long streamers of silk, darted and leapt away from chain blades and bolts like dancers, slashing limbs with monofilament wire blades. Glass-armored guards charged forward in solid ranks, stabbing with their halberds, yet none of the foes was a match for the disciplined countercharges of the Emperor's children. The slick perfection of their pattern-perfect warfare kept its edge, even amid the storm of fire and death that filled the throne room. Lucius ducked and wove through the fire towards the gold-armored figure, shrapnel flashing against the energized edge of his sword blade. The man's armor was ancient, yet gloriously ornate, the equal in finery of a Lord Commander of the Emperor's children. He carried a long spear, its shaft terminated at both ends by a howling ripple of lethal harmonies. Lucius ducked under a swipe of the weapon, stepping nimbly to the side and bringing his sword up towards his opponent's midriff. Faster than he would have believed possible, the spear reversed, and a tremendous blast of noise battered his sword away before it struck. Lucius danced back as a killing wave of sound blared from the tubes and speakers mounted on the Golden Warrior's back, a whole section of the mosaic floor ploughed in a torn gouge by the sound. One of the palace guards fell at Lucius's feet, his chest blown open by Rylander's fire, and another toppled as one of Nassicay sliced off his leg. The Emperor's children surged forwards to help him, but he waved them back. This was to be his kill. He leapt onto the throne pedestal, the Golden Warrior silhouetted in the light streaming from the distant ceiling. The screaming spear came down, and Lucius ducked to avoid it, pushing himself forwards. He stabbed with his sword, but a pitch-perfect note sent his sword plunging towards the floor of the dais instead of its intended target. Lucius hauled his sword clear as the spear stabbed for him again, the musical edge shearing past him and blistering the purple and gilt of his armor. The battle raged ferociously around him, but it was an irrelevance, for Lucius knew that he must surely be fighting the leader of this rebellion. Only Vardus Pral would surround himself with such fearsome bodyguards. Lucius pivoted away from another strike, spinning around behind Pral and shearing his sword through the speaker tubes and loudspeakers upon his back. He felt a glorious surge of satisfaction as the glowing edge cut through the metal with ease. A terrific, booming noise blared from the severed pipes, and Lucius was hurled from the dais by the force of the blast. His armor cracked with the force, and the music leapt in clarity as he felt its power surge around his body in a glorious wash of pure, unadulterated sensation. The music sang in his blood, promising yet more glories, and the unfettered excess of music, light, and hedonistic indulgence. Lucius felt the music in his soul and knew that he wanted it more than he had wanted anything in his life. He looked up as the Golden Warrior leapt lightly from the throne, seeing the music as swirling lines of power and promise that flowed like water in the air. "Now you die," said Lucius, as the song of death took hold of him. In later moments, they would name it Death's Tomb, and Loken had never felt such disgust at the sights he saw within it. Even Davin's Moon, where the swamps had vomited up the living dead to attack the sons of Horus, had not been this bad. The sound of battle was a hellish music of screaming, rising in terrible crescendos, and the sight was horrendous. Death's Tomb was brimming with corpses, festering in charnel heaps and bubbling with corruption. The tomb spire Loken and the sons of Horus fought within was larger inside than out, the floor sunken into a pit where the dead had been thrown. The tomb was that of death itself. A mausoleum of blood-stained black iron, carved into swirls and scrollwork, dominated the pit, topped with a sculpture of Father Istvan himself, a massive bearded sky god who took away the souls of the faithful and cast the rest into the sky to languish with his lost children. A war singer perched on Father Istvan's black shoulder, screaming a song of death that jarred at Loken's nerves and sent jangling pain along his limbs. Hundreds of Istvanian soldiers surrounded the pit, firing from the hip as they ran towards the Astartes, driven forward by the shrieking death song. "At them!" yelled Loken, and before he could draw breath again, the enemy was upon them. The Astartes of the spearhead streamed through the many archways leading into the tomb spire, guns blazing as soon as they saw the enemy swarming towards them. Loken fired a fusillade of shots before the two sides clashed. More than 2,000 sons of Horus charged into battle, and Death's Tomb became a vast amphitheater for a great and terrible slaughter, like the arenas of the ancient Romani. "Stay close, back to back, and advance," cried Loken, but he could only hope that his fellow warriors could hear him over the vox. The screaming was deafening. Every Istvanian soldier's mouth jammed open and howling in the shrieking cadences of the war singer's music.